when a group of privileged high school students mocked and humiliated the elderly school janitor, they never expected their viral video to catch the attention of a feared Hells Angels captain with a personal connection. What happens when this leather-clad biker shows up at the school entrance with dozens of motorcycles rumbling behind him? And how will the students react when they discover whose father they've been tormenting? The morning sun hadn't yet broken over the hills when Thomas Miller pulled his old truck into the empty school parking lot. The air was cool, and birds chirped in the trees as he grabbed his lunch pail and trudged toward the side entrance of Westridge High. For 15 years, he'd arrived at 5:30 a.m. sharp to begin his work as the school janitor, long before any teachers or students filled these quiet halls. Inside, Thomas flipped on the lights and headed to his small closet. The room smelled of pine cleaner and old mops. He changed into his blue uniform, noticing a new tear in the elbow. He'd need to sew that tonight. From his wallet, he pulled out a worn photo of his son Michael on his 18th birthday, the last happy day they'd spent together. Michael smiled in the picture, his arm around Thomas's shoulder. That was 7 years ago, before the fights, before Michael joined that motorcycle gang, before the painful silence between them. "Morning, Miller," called Principal Dawson, startling Thomas from his thoughts. The principal never stopped to chat, just nodded as he passed with his coffee cup, heading to his big office with the view of the football field. Thomas wheeled his bucket and mopped down the main hallway, his shoes squeaking on the freshly cleaned floor. He took pride in his work, making sure every inch of Westridge High gleamed before the first bell rang. The school served the richest families in the county: doctors' kids, lawyers' kids, business owners' kids. Thomas's own son had come here too, though they'd lived in the small apartment complex across town. Michael had struggled to fit in, always aware of the difference between himself and his classmates. By 8:15, the halls filled with noise. Students streamed in, laughing and shouting, dropping papers and kicking lockers. Thomas pressed himself against the wall, trying to stay invisible as he always did. But today, Brett Thornton and his friends spotted him. "Hey, look who it is! Old Man Miller," Brett called out. The tall senior wore a lacrosse jacket and expensive sneakers. His friends gathered around him, smirking. "My dad says he pays enough taxes that you should wash his car, too." The boys laughed, and Thomas kept his eyes down. He'd learned long ago not to engage. Brett stepped closer and kicked over the yellow caution sign Thomas had placed by a wet spot. "Oops," Brett said with fake concern. "Didn't see that there." Thomas bent to pick it up, and as he did, Brett deliberately knocked his mop bucket over with his foot. Dirty water spread across the floor, undoing an hour of work. "Hey, garbage man, you missed a spot," another boy called out, as they all took photos with their phones. Thomas's face burned with shame, but he remained silent, righting his bucket and reaching for his mop again. The bell rang, and the boys walked away laughing, leaving Thomas to start over. In his pocket, his calloused fingers touched the edge of Michael's photo, his one reminder of happiness. "People like him couldn't afford college," he heard Brett say as they turned the corner. "That's why they end up as janitors." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. That was exactly why Michael had been so angry. No money for college, no way out. And now, because of their fight, Thomas didn't even know where his son was living these days, or if he ever thought of his father at all. The mockery became part of Thomas's daily life at Westridge High. Each morning, he would find new messes left just for him. Toilet paper strung across the bathroom, soda spilled on purpose, lunch trays stacked in sinks. Brett and his friends made a game of it, watching from around corners as Thomas silently cleaned up after them. One Tuesday, Thomas opened his locker in the small break room to find crude drawings taped inside. They showed a stick figure with a mop, big tears falling down its face. Old Man Miller was written at the top in messy letters. He quickly tore them down before Ms. Rivera, the kind English teacher, could see them as she entered the room. "Good morning, Thomas," she said with a smile. "Don't let those kids get to you. They don't understand what it means to work hard." Thomas nodded, but said nothing. He'd learned that speaking up only made things worse. Ms. Rivera was nice, but she couldn't stop what was happening. No one could. At lunch, Thomas sat alone at a small table in the corner of the break room. He unwrapped his sandwich, peanut butter, the cheap kind, and took a small bite. His stomach hurt these days, tight with worry and shame. When he went to get his lunchbox later, it was gone. He found it in the trash, his apple and cookies missing. After school, Thomas drove home to his small apartment. The stairs creaked as he climbed to the second floor. Inside, the walls were thin, and he could hear his neighbors arguing next door. He sat at his kitchen table, the light overhead buzzing softly. His fingers moved to his phone, scrolling to Michael's number. 5 years of silence hung between them. Thomas remembered their last fight clearly. Michael had just turned 20, angry at the world. "I'm joining the Angels," he'd announced. "At least they respect me." Thomas had yelled, said things he wished he could take back. "You're throwing your life away," were his last words to his son before Michael walked out. Now, all Thomas knew was that Michael had risen in the ranks of the Hells Angels, becoming someone important in the group. The thought made Thomas's heart ache. The next day at school was worse than usual. Brett and 6 other boys followed Thomas down the hall, mimicking his walk, his stooped shoulders. "Hey, Miller, my toilet's clogged at home. You free after school?" Brett called out. The other boys laughed. Principal Dawson walked by, seeing everything. "Move along, boys," was all he said before continuing to his office. By Friday, Thomas felt a heaviness in his chest that wouldn't go away. As he was cleaning the hallway after the final bell, Brett appeared with his friends. "We have a surprise for you, Miller," Brett said with a cold smile. They surrounded him, pushing him backward toward the supply closet. Thomas stumbled, his back hitting the shelves. "Please," he said quietly. "I need to finish my work." "Take a break," Brett laughed, as one boy grabbed Thomas's phone from his pocket. Another snatched his keys. Then they slammed the door shut, the lock clicking into place. "Hey everyone, watch this," Thomas heard Brett say outside. They were filming it all. In the dark closet, Thomas felt his chest tighten. His asthma. His inhaler was in his locker. He banged on the door, called out, but the boys just laughed louder. Then their voices faded as they left him there, locked in the small, dark space with cleaning chemicals burning his nose and fear gripping his heart. The school custodian found Thomas the next morning, curled on the floor of the supply closet. Thomas's face was pale, his breathing raspy from the long night without his inhaler. His old bones ached from sleeping on the hard concrete floor. The custodian helped Thomas to his feet as Ms. Rivera rushed over, her eyes wide with worry. "Thomas, what happened?" she asked, steadying him with a gentle hand. Her perfume smelled like flowers, a nice change from the harsh cleaning supplies that had filled his nose all night. "Those boys," the custodian explained, shaking his head. "They locked him in. I found this taped to the door." He held up a paper sign that read, "Do not open. Trash inside." Ms. Rivera's face turned red with anger. This is going too far. Come on, Thomas. We're going to the nurse, and then we're talking to Principal Dawson." Thomas couldn't fight her as she led him down the hall. Students stared as they passed. Some looked away in shame, while others snickered behind their hands. In the nurse's office, Thomas took puffs from a spare inhaler while Ms. Rivera called Principal Dawson. Through the thin walls, Thomas heard her raised voice. "This isn't kids being kids, Jim. This is assault. They left him overnight without his medication. He could have died." But when Principal Dawson arrived, his concern seemed more about the school than about Thomas. "Now, let's not blow this out of proportion," he said, straightening his tie. "Boys will be boys. I'm sure they didn't realize how serious it was." "They filmed it," Thomas said quietly, his first words since being found. "They put it on their phones." Ms. Rivera's eyes grew wider. "They recorded themselves committing a crime and posted it online?" Across town, in a dark bar called the Roadhouse, Michael Miller sat with 5 other Hells Angels members. At 32, Michael had earned his place as the chapter captain, his leather vest covered in patches that told the story of his rise. His dark beard and cold eyes made most people nervous, but his men respected him. "Captain, you gotta see this," said Razor, sliding his phone across the sticky bar top. "Isn't that your old man?" Michael picked up the phone and watched the video that was going viral across their small town. His father, being mocked and shoved into a closet by laughing teenagers. The caption read, "Taking out the trash at Westridge High." Michael's hand tightened around the phone until his knuckles turned white. "Play it again," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. The other bikers watched their captain's face darken as he watched his father's humiliation for the second time. Michael hadn't spoken to Thomas in 5 years. Not since their big fight when he joined the Angels, but seeing his father treated this way woke something fierce inside him. "That's enough." Michael stood up suddenly, draining his beer in one gulp. "Razor, call everyone. Full chapter meeting in an hour." By noon, 25 motorcycles roared down Main Street, turning heads and setting off car alarms. People stepped back on sidewalks as the Hells Angels thundered past. At their front rode Michael, his face set like stone behind his dark sunglasses. At Westridge High, the lunch bell had just rung when the first students noticed the rumble of engines in the parking lot. Brett and his friends stood at the cafeteria windows, watching in shock as motorcycle after motorcycle pulled in, forming a half circle around the main entrance. "What's happening?" Brett asked, his voice higher than normal. Principal Dawson rushed outside, his face pale. "You can't be here," he shouted at the bikers. "This is school property." Michael removed his helmet slowly, revealing the same dark eyes that Thomas had. He stepped forward, towering over the principal. "That man you call a janitor," Michael said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent parking lot. "That's my father." A strange hush fell over Westridge High as students and teachers gathered at windows to watch. Principal Dawson's face had turned the color of paper as he stood before Michael Miller and 25 leather-clad bikers. "Your father." Principal Dawson's voice cracked. "Thomas is your father?" "Yes," Michael said, his voice firm but controlled. "And I want to talk to the boys who locked him in that closet." By now, Thomas had come outside too, drawn by the commotion. He froze when he saw his son standing there, bigger and harder than the boy who had left home 5 years ago, but still unmistakably Michael. Brett and his friends huddled by the door, their faces no longer showing any trace of the boldness they'd had just days before. "I'm not here for trouble," Michael told the principal as teachers began herding students back inside. "I'm here because no one else stood up for him." He pointed at Brett. "That one. He's the ringleader." Principal Dawson turned to Brett, who suddenly looked very small. "Mr. Thornton, my office. Now." As Brett slunk toward the school doors, Michael walked over to Thomas. The distance between them felt wider than the 5 years that had passed. "Dad," Michael said simply. Thomas looked up at his son, his eyes wet. "Michael." They stood awkwardly until Michael reached out and put his hand on his father's thin shoulder. "I saw what they did to you." Thomas nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Inside the principal's office, with Ms. Rivera insisting on being present, Brett and his friends faced serious consequences: 2-week suspensions, community service, and a special requirement. They would spend those 2 weeks helping Thomas clean the school, learning firsthand what his job entailed. The next Monday, Thomas arrived at work to find something odd. The hallways were mostly clean already. Students nodded at him as they passed. Some even said, "Good morning, Mr. Miller." In the break room, his lunch sat untouched in the fridge. On Wednesday, Michael's motorcycle rumbled into the parking lot at lunchtime. Thomas walked out to meet him, still not quite believing this change in their relationship. "Thought you might want this," Michael said, handing his father a paper bag. Inside was a sandwich from the diner where Thomas used to take Michael as a child. They sat on a bench outside, eating quietly at first. "I'm sorry for what I said," Thomas finally spoke. "About you throwing your life away." Michael nodded. "And I'm sorry for staying away so long." In the afternoon, Thomas watched as Brett and 2 other boys scrubbed bathroom floors under his direction. Their hands were red and sore, their expensive clothes stained with cleaning products. "Sir?" Brett said quietly when the others had moved to the next stall. "I didn't know. About your son?" "Would it have mattered?" Thomas asked. Brett looked down. "No, and I'm sorry for that." As the days passed, a new respect grew in the school halls. Thomas stood straighter now, making eye contact with students who greeted him by name. Even Principal Dawson treated him differently, asking about his day, offering him a real place at staff meetings. On Friday afternoon, as Thomas finished his shift, he found Ms. Rivera changing a light bulb in her classroom. "Let me help you with that," he offered, taking the bulb from her hands. "Things are different around here," she said with a smile. Thomas nodded, looking out the window where he could see Michael's motorcycle waiting in the parking lot. "Sometimes," he said with a small smile, "people just need a reminder about who really matters." He reached into his pocket and touched the new photo that sat beside the old one, this one taken just last Sunday when Michael had come over for dinner. Father and son, together again. As Thomas walked out into the sunlight, Michael revved his bike's engine. "Ready to go home, Dad?" he called. Thomas climbed on behind his son, no longer invisible, no longer alone. As they pulled away from Westridge High, he felt lighter than he had in years.